In reply to your favor, I'm very glad to inform you that we are ready to start for America on the 22nd of September on board of Chinanu Maru, if you so kindly arrange for us. I had been much bothered about how to show you the true art of Jujutsu before accepting your proposition, because I was afraid that there is no Japanese resident there who is able to show you the art as my opponent. But fortunately, I have got a young Japanese gentleman, one of my pupils, who is very clever and whose father is a judge of the Tokyo Supreme Court, who voluntarily applied to go to America with us at his own expense, which I have gladly consented to, asking you to give your kindest regards to Mr. Samuel Hill and your son. So on September 23rd, 1903, the 38-year-old Yamashita and his 25-year-old wife Fude and his 19-year-old assistant Saburo Kawaichi boarded the Chinanu Maru in Yokohama. Since Hill was paying his fare, Yamashita traveled first class. On the other hand, Kawaguchi traveled second class, doubtless because his father was paying his way. Still, neither man traveled steerage. So when they arrived in Seattle 15 days later, Yamashita proudly told immigration officials that he was a professor hired to teach Jiu-Jitsu to Mr. Hill's children. Kawaguchi just as proudly proclaimed himself Professor Yamashita assistant. On Saturday, October 17, 1903, Yamashita and Kawaguchi gave a judo exhibition on the Seattle Theater. This was a private show and not a public one. The theater was between shows and he hired it for the evening. Guests included Sam Hill's mother-in-law, Mary Hill, wife of railroader J.J. Hill, the man of whom it was said, "In the West there are many mountains, but only one hill." Senator Russell Alger, a Republican from Michigan and former Secretary of War, and several Seattle sports writers. So far as I know, this was the first time Kodokan Judo was shown to a non-Japanese audience in North America. Since journalist H. Irving Hancock had begun studying Jiu-Jitsu in New York City as early as 1896. This statement refers solely to Kodokan Judo. During his show, Yamashita told the audience that Judo was a word meaning victory by pliancy or gelding. Was this meant? He was quoted in the Post-Intelligencer as saying that was that when the opponent in a hand-to-hand conflict exerts the greatest muscular power, he is the easiest to overcome. For the expert in Judo, by a subtle trick of gelding, converts the antagonist's momentum into his own destruction. The unfortunate lessens too far, loses his balance, and swift as lightning the adept exerts one of his peculiar holds on the neck or arm. Furthermore, Judo was an exercise in social Darwinism. Only the fittest survive, and the life of each master is a long struggle for supremacy. The devotees of the science and the art say the same stern principles exhibited in the physical practice are carried into the moral precepts. Only a few reach that stage, the majority stopping at physical development and the lessons of honesty and sobriety. Speeches done. Yamashita and Kawaguchi demonstrated various throws and holds for the crowd. People seeing such demonstrations for the first time invariably thought they were prearranged gymnastics rather than real wrestling. Sports writer Ed Hughes of the Seattle Times, for example, wrote in January 1912 that Sam Hill years ago brought over some jiu-jitsu experts from Japan and showed them at the Seattle Theater. The Japanese Mr. Hill brought over here used to give clever exhibitions, but it was exhibitions stuff purely. It was not the real thing. Doubtless thinking the same thing, Hill quietly arranged for Yamashita to meet someone who was not part of his personal troupe. After all, he wanted a jiu-jitsu teacher, not an acrobat. Towards this end, he arranged a bout with some professional wrestlers in Seattle. When the wrestler failed to appear, he substituted a guest named C.E. Radcliffe, a 210-pound Englishman who was properly trained amateur boxer. According to the British wrestling writer Percy Longhurst, writing in Superman magazine in May 1936. Here is what the boxer has to say about the encounter. I confess I have never been up against such a slippery customer as the little Jap. To land him fairly on the head or body was impossible. He avoided punishment by falling backwards or forwards. At once, even passed between my legs, almost stroking me as he did so, and recovering his feet behind me in the time to avoid a vicious backhand swing. I tried everything from straight punches to windmill swings, but he was too good for me. Once he had come to close quarters, a certain fall for me was the result. After taking 3 or 4 heavy tosses, I had had enough of it, having due regard to the fact that I had an hour or so before just got through a long and good dinner. His worries about the professor's abilities gone, Hill then took his Japanese to the District of Columbia to meet James Nathan Hill. What James Nathan thought of the professor and his judo is unknown, but as James Nathan was notoriously lazy, what he had to say about it is probably better imagined than repeated. For Yamashita, the trip east was hardly wasted. For one thing, he got to see a lot of railroads along the way, which, after all, may have been one reason for the trip in the first place. Yamashita's sponsors included several leading Japanese industrialists. For another, he had no trouble finding a job teaching judo to the children of the Washington elite, while his regular students were mostly rich men's daughters. Irving Hancock's physical training for women by Japanese methods was then quite fashionable. He didn't mind, as according to an article in the New York World, Yamashita's only requirement in his judo classes was an absolute good temper. His wife was equally fortunate, and her students included the daughters of the Democratic Vice Presidential candidate and a former governor of Mississippi. While in the District of Columbia, Professor Yamashita gave some lessons at the Japanese legation. The Japanese naval attaché, Lieutenant Commander Isamu Takeshita, was from a samurai family and knew a good thing when he saw it. In 1926, he persuaded Aikido founder Morihei Ueshiba to move to Tokyo, and in 1935 he introduced Aikibudo, as Aikido was then known, into the United States. So it is hardly surprising that in March 1904 he also arranged for Professor Yamashita to meet with President Theodore Roosevelt in the White House. As Roosevelt put in a letter to his sons, he believed in rough, manly sports, so long as they did not degenerate into the sole end of one's existence. Oh. Character counts for a great deal more than either intellect or body in winning success in life. And he thought he knew all about Jiu-Jitsu. After all, in 1902, his wrestling instructor, a Philadelphia policeman named James J. O'Brien, had shown him some tricks he had learned in Japan. O'Brien had been a constable at Umegasaki Station from 1895 to 1899, so the instruction was legitimate. According to an article published in Literary Digest in August 1927, O'Brien began his demonstration by showing Roosevelt some technical illustration. Suddenly, Roosevelt stopped at a photo of a woman sticking her stiff fingers into a man's eyes. A little worried lest this maneuver should make an unfavorable impression, Captain O'Brien stammered, "Mr. President, a dangerous situation requires a desperate defense that was invented to give a woman protection against a thug who suddenly attacked her." Colonel Roosevelt's response, according to a writer in the Philadelphia Public Ledger, was reassuring. "I think, Captain," he reported to have said, "that this is the best thing in your repertory." No matter what Yamashita showed was a complete system rather than a few simple tricks, and despite what everyone thought, his acts were not prearranged. They were that good. Therefore, in the words of the New York World, Yamashita and his partner caused Mr. Roosevelt to quit winking and gasp. They showed him what Jiu-Jitsu really was, and they were engaged on the spot. Although the world reported that there were 7 degrees in Jiu-Jitsu, and Roosevelt intended to have at least 5 of them. Roosevelt's primary goal in all of this was not rank, but weight reduction. Since becoming president, his weight had soared to over 220 pounds, and he hoped to be down by 200 by the elections. So during March and April 1904, Roosevelt practiced judo 3 afternoons a week, using a ground floor office in the White House as his workout space. Then, for the rest of the summer, he practiced occasionally, and he stopped training during the elections. The president trained partners, including his sons, his private secretary, the Japanese Naval Attaché, Secretary of War William Howard Taft, and Secretary of the Interior Gifford Pinchot. When these people were unavailable, then Roosevelt tried his tricks on husky young visitors. They later included Robert Johnstone Mooney, who with his brother visited the White House on the afternoon of Thursday. According to an article published in the Outlook in 1923, Mooney's brother was noted amateur boxer, so after doing a little sparring with the 2 young men, Roosevelt sprang to his feet, excitedly asked, "By the way, do you boys understand Jiu-Jitsu?" We replied in the negative, and he continued pounding the air with his arms. "You must promise me to learn that without delay. You are so good in other athletics that you must add Jiu-Jitsu to your other accomplishment." Every American athlete ought to understand the Japanese system thoroughly, and he smiled reminiscently. I practically introduced it to the Americans. I had a young Japanese now at Harvard, Kigataki, here for 6 months. I tried jiu-jitsu with him day after day, but he always defeated me. I was not easy to learn. It was not easy to learn. However, one day I got him good and plenty. I threw him clear over my head on his belly, and I had it. Then, to prove his point, Roosevelt demonstrated his techniques on the Moonies using considerably more enthusiasm than control. Professor Yamashita remarked the same problem. Of course, according to an American journalist named Joseph Clark, Yamashita later said that while Roosevelt was his best pupil, he was also very heavy and very impetuous, and it had caused the poor professor many bruisings, much worry, and infinite pains during Theodore's rushes to avoid lambing the President of the United States. The President probably agreed with these statements. For example, on March 5, 1904, he wrote his son Kermit, "My throat is a little sore because once when one of them had a stranglehold, I also got a hold of his windpipe, and I thought I could perhaps choke him out before he could choke me. However, he got ahead." A month later, he wrote his son Theodore Jr., "I am very glad I have been doing this Japanese wrestling, but when I'm through with this time, I am not all sure I shall ever try it again. I find the wrestling a trifle too vehement for mere rest. My right ankle and left wrist and one thumb and both great toes are swollen sufficiently to more or less impair their usefulness. I am well mottled with bruises elsewhere. Stiff, I have made a good progress, and since you have left, they taught me 3 new throws that are perfect corkers." Yamashita left Washington around May 1904. Apparently, someone, probably he or Roosevelt, had suggested that he teach judo to Harvard football players, thereby reducing the risk of death or a serious injury. But this never occurred, as at the instance of President Roosevelt, Yamashita instead took a position teaching judo at the U.S. Naval Academy. Well, Yamashita started at the Naval Academy in January 1905. Training took place Monday, Wednesday, and Friday afternoons. He earned 1,666 for the semester, but had to pay his own assistance. The class had about 25 students. While teaching these classes, Yamashita constantly stressed that what he taught was a gentlemanly art rather than something done by ruffians or professional wrestlers. Opinions regarding the quality of his instruction varied widely. According to the Army and Navy Journal for February 18, 1905, some believed it was the best possible means of physical training, while others regarded it as of little value. Indeed of positive harm, as inculcating unfair and unsportsmanlike ideas of physical contests. Such debates occurred throughout North America during 1905. Much of the debate was engendered by the Russo-Japanese War, in which Japanese propagandists routinely attributed their successes to military judo training, and Irving Hancock and Robert Edgren, a pair of journalists who were touting the wrestling skills of a jiu-jitsu man named Katsukuma Higashi, engendered more, while the later grossly exaggerated Higashi's actual ability. He lost in 3 straight falls to an American wrestler named George Botner in April 1905, and in minutes to a British judoka named Yuki Otani in November 1905. The hype generated much controversy, wanting to know the answer for himself on Thursday, February 23, 1905. The president arranged a private match between Professor Yamashita and a middleweight catch-as-catch-can wrestler named Joseph Grant. In a letter to his son Kermit, Roosevelt described the outcome. Grant did not know what to expect to put Yamashita on his back, and Yamashita was perfectly content to be on his back. Inside of a minute, Yamashita had shown Grant, and inside of 2 minutes more, he had got an elbow hold on him. Still, Grant, in the actual wrestling and throwing, was about as good as the Japanese, and he was so much stronger that he evidently hurt and wore out the little Japanese. Meanwhile, the U.S. Army also expressed interest in learning if judo had as much merit in military training as the Japanese propagandists claimed. Toward answering this question, Brigadier General Albert L. Mills and Captain Frank W. Coe of the Military Academy and Captain Peyton C. March of the Army's Bayonet and Sword Committee visited Annapolis on Saturday, March 4, 1905. After meeting with Commander William F. Halsey Sr. and Surgeon Edward S. Bogart Jr. of the Naval Academy, the officers observed a demonstration given by Yamashita and his midshipmen. Afterward, their official report said that Jiu-Jitsu is not of great value as a means of physical development, but the possession of a knowledge of this system will inspire the individual with a degree of self-confidence. Hence, it is recommended that Jiu-Jitsu be incorporated in the physical training course with boxing and wrestling. As it turned out, the Military Academy hired a retired world wrestling champion named Tom Jenkins instead, and never once regretted the decision. 3 weeks later, Yamashita, Kitagaki, and midshipmen McConnell, Pearsall, Gormley, and Haim gave their first public judo demonstration. While the crowd watched politely, it greatly preferred the boxing and wrestling shows that followed. A second show given in May 1905 met an equally cool response, said the Army and Naval Journal afterward. While some of the holds were undoubtedly serviceable if procured, the contestants worked together in such a way as to give no indication that the Americans had learned anything that would be of real use to them in a tight place. Exhibitions were given of how to stop an opponent who hit, kicked, or rushed, but it was noticeable that the men on the defense had an understanding of the particular attack he had to meet and receive his opponent as prearranged. Although disappointed by the response, Yamashita left Annapolis in June, fully expecting to be rehired in the fall. And the only judo he did publicly during summer of 1905 was a Russo-Japanese War benefit held at the Lafayette Theater in Washington, D.C. on June 30th. His partner in this demonstration was Saburo Koshiba of Tokyo. Then, on October the Naval Academy told Yamashita that it had no money for a judo program and that his services were no longer required. About the same time that Yamashita was packing his bags, President Roosevelt happened to ask the Japanese ambassador how his former judo teacher was doing. Upon hearing the answer, the president asked the Secretary of Navy if there was some reason that Yamashita should not be rehired for at least one more year, as Secretary Charles J. Bonaparte could not think of a reason he cared to tell the president. He immediately sent a letter to the new superintendent of the Naval Academy, Rear Admiral James H. Sands. Rear Admiral James H. Sands asking him to please take the necessary steps to comply with the wishes of the president. As one would expect, Admiral Sands in turn wasted no time telling his staff to find a way of funding the president's judo program. Within 2 weeks, the Naval Academy staff had designed a curriculum that moved 1,700 into the appropriate budget. Admiral Sands then asked Yamashita to please come by his office in Annapolis to arrange for the course of instruction in judo. On December 4, 1905, Admiral Sands signed a contract with Yamashita in which the latter was to keep 50-hour lessons.